Leave the taking off the pads out of the patient. Leave that with the paramedics, leave that with the fire department. Let them do that. We turn it on, we put it on the patient. We do not turn it off. We do not take it off from the patient. Special considerations. In order for these pads to work safely and effectively, these pads, they have to be at least 1 inch away from each other, 1 inch away from any electronic devices, 1 inch away from any metal devices. So what we're going to do is address each one. Okay, first, 1 inch away from each other. When we're dealing with adult patients, regardless of how big or small the adult is, their top right and their bottom left, there will always be at least a 1 inch gap. However, what if you get a small child or maybe even an infant in cardiac arrest and you only have adult pads? Keep in mind, if you have infant that is in cardiac arrest, you would like to use the infant pads that's provided. However, not always the case where we have an infant pads. You can still use adult pads on an infant. Solution to that is one front, one pad at the back, and you want to get it on the patient's bare, dry chest and their bare back. Other special consideration, 1 inch away from any metal devices. We briefly talked about making sure that we want to take the patient's shirt off and also taking the patient's bra off when we're providing CPR supplemented with the AED. We need to take the bra off simply because metal and electricity do not go well together. If there is a metal lining underneath the bra and I just blindly put these pads on top of the bra, you now run the risk, if it sends the shock, of frying the pads, the skin, the bra, the metal, everything else in between. This is why we want to make sure we're taking off all the clothing and all of the bra off as well, so that way we can put these pads directly on the patient's bare, dry chest. Piercings. We are not concerned about glasses, earrings, necklaces, watches, anything of that sort. We're talking in the sense of metal in the form of directly underneath these pads. So for example, you've exposed the patient's chest and you see rings, nipple rings, where the pads need to go. If there are rings where the pads need to go, remember, do not blindly put these pads on top of it. You want to make sure you're either taking those rings off or put the pads 1 inch away from it. It's okay if the patient has a necklace on them. It's okay if the patient has metal in them. Where it's not okay is metal, again, directly underneath these pads. If the patient has a necklace on, it's important that you do not put these pads directly on top of the necklace. Simply put it away from it. For best practice, for everyone's safety, just take off the necklace and then put the pads on. Electronic devices. When I say electronic devices, I do not mean cell phones, radios, pagers, or anything of that sort. What I mean by electronic devices are, keep in mind, this is called an AED, which is an automated external defibrillator. A lot of times patients with predisposed heart conditions, they can get what's called either a pacemaker or an internal defibrillator. Essentially, this device shrunken up, put inside the patient's chest cavity. If that's the case, you want to make sure you're putting these pads not on top of it, but at least 1 inch away from it. From my personal experience, any internal defibrillators or pacemakers are usually at the center of the patient's chest or the top left of their chest, for good reason, because should that patient go down, the pads, the AED pads, go top right, bottom left. Even if I have a pacemaker on the center of my chest or the top left of my chest, that should be no problem. Now, if we have a patient and there is a scar here and we know that something was added to it, whether it's a pacemaker or an internal defibrillator, is it okay for us to do compressions on top of it? While it's not ideal, it's the only viable option that we have. Keep in mind, the premise and the purpose of the internal defibrillators or pacemakers was to make sure the patient doesn't go into cardiac arrest. If they go into cardiac arrest, that is our only viable option, then we are to do CPR on top of the pacemaker. Other special considerations, pregnant patients. Pregnant patients, there's not much difference when we're doing CPR or when we're attaching the AED. Everything is the same. If that ever was to happen, you are allowed to do CPR and the AED on a patient who is pregnant that is in cardiac arrest. Last but not least, for AED safety, you do not want to be using the AED when you're in standing water. It's okay to do CPR and AED if we're outside in the rain, as long as we're not in standing water. To ensure that you're not in standing water, just make sure that we do what's called the splash test. The splash test entails, before I push shock, I stand up and I just try to make splashes with puddles on my feet where I'm standing. If I'm standing up and I start stomping and water is not splashing up, however, it is raining on myself, my patient, my partner, it is okay for me to push shock because we're not in standing water. The only person that will get the shock is the patient. Conversely, if I stand up and I start doing the splash test and water is splashing up, that means that myself, most likely my partner, and my patient are in standing water. It's important that before we push shock, I need to take that same patient somewhere a little bit more dry, and then we can push shock. And it's okay that I'm wet, my patient and my partner are wet. Where it's not okay is if we are in standing water.